Sansa has what you could call a princess complex. She's almost the embodiment of a stereotypical perfect girl. She does mostly as she is told. She follows her manners and courtesies almost professionally. It is clear early in the first book or in the show that Sansa has put an emphasis on becoming the very best lady, as in a lady in regards to a high-born daughter of a noble lord. Sansa makes her dresses, speaks appropriately, performs her courtesies, and is always shown to do what is expected of her. Whenever she is scolded, it can be characterized as no more than typical teenage girl antics. Sansa is the epitome of expectations, and while this serves the character well enough, there's a disconnect from the reader or the audience. People find Sansa boring. She simply meets the expectation and nothing more. And well, that's kind of the point. While Sansa would never be able to carry a story on her own with her origin story, the benefit of her character being attached to a much larger story allows the audience to tolerate the Sansa chapters until their favorite character's POV comes along in the pages that follow. Here's the thing. As the rest of this fascinating story takes place around Sansa, something begins to shift as you near the end of the first book. Sansa becomes more interesting, more self-aware. At times, she does begin to question if she's simply just reciting the fancy words that her septa has instructed her to recite. Sansa has no agency, but there are flickers of something maybe a little bit more independent occurring within Sansa's thoughts. The one area that all Stark children have a special power of working in connection with their direwolves, Sansa, sadly, no longer has her direwolf, all to appease the cruelty of Queen Cersei. Cersei, a woman much harsher than Sansa, and yet Cersei holds the position that Sansa aspires to have for herself someday. And well, I think now is as good of a time as any to discuss something in particular. Sansa represents the story's femininity. On the spectrum of traditional feminine character traits, Sansa could be considered the baseline, where someone like Daenerys eventually achieves power with her dragons, or Arya has many mentors in Syrio Forel, the Hound, and eventually her time training in the House of Black and White. And of course, the gender roles are confronted within characters such as Asha Greyjoy or Brienne of Tarth. The commentary or messaging here is kind of open for interpretation, but it is objectively observational that Sansa falls into the most stereotypical feminine role. The idea being that to come into power as a woman, women must discard their identity as feminine in favor of more traditionally masculine traits. Essentially, the women mentioned either have magical power or proficient skill, or they must evolve or adapt themselves to stereotypical male roles. However, in many of these scenarios, disregarding femininity to seek power or respect among their male counterparts, this could suggest that feminine characteristics are a weakness. This is how many view Sansa. They see her as weak, or only useful as a playing piece in the Game of Thrones, but never a player. Yet there's multiple characters that survive in this world without brute power or physical gifts for violence, where the political mind and manipulation can be used as a tactic as fierce as that of the battle commander. You see a character such as Littlefinger enters this story, and the more you read, the influence Littlefinger has had among the greater story is undeniable. For Sansa to find herself in the care and guidance of Littlefinger opens another opportunity in storytelling. Perhaps instead of discarding femininity, as many other female characters have done, Sansa may transcend her feminine core. Where much of the criticism that surrounds Sansa is that she is too naive, that is the defining aspect of her character arc in many ways. Sansa believes that standing beside her prince or her king is the only role that her life must play. The greater insult to the audience might be that Sansa seems enthusiastic about this role, Where we see every other female POV character pushing back on the gender-focused stereotypes, Sansa is happy to be where she is. Look, I used to think Sansa was the weakest character in the books and in the show, and from her position, she actually is in a weak place as far as any type of leverage. But what I've come to discover later on in my reading, especially from A Clash of Kings through A Storm of Swords, is that for her world, she was simply playing by the rules, where Sansa is called a stupid girl for this, when many other characters are considered evil or villainous for not playing by the rules. It isn't entirely hypocritical, because you do need to take circumstance into consideration, but I want you to keep some of that in mind as we dive in here a little bit deeper. I think audiences have a natural human element when we see suffering. You can see this in your own reaction maybe when you watched Game of Thrones and saw Theon tortured by Ramsay, or in the book, the mistreatment of Jaime Lannister by the Brave Companions, or in the show, he's tormented by the character Locke and Roose Bolton's men. The difference in a lot of this is that the characters Jaime and Theon are given an opportunity to be heroic, or we learn of their prior heroics. Theon in the show is given the opportunity to save Sansa, ironically, and in both show and books we learn of Jaime saving the people of King's Landing, and just a bit later we actually see Jaime save Brienne. And even other characters like Arya and Daenerys are given opportunities to seek out revenge, and much more obvious character arcs. And there's more to all of those character arcs, of course, but when you look at Sansa in King's Landing, she's just a chessboard piece. And her innocence at times is used against her. As a young girl unaware of the consequences, Sansa informs Cersei of Ned's plans to send the Stark girls back home, giving Cersei additional leverage against her father. Sansa grew up hearing of all the lavish and beautiful lifestyles of royalty, and here she is about to marry into this perception with her betrothal to Joffrey. Finding the only thing she's ever wanted threatened to be taken away, she does the predictable thing, and she defies her father. Sansa's innocence and overall naivety is used to condemn her by the reader, but it is clear in the books that Sansa does not know any better. Ned Stark withholds the truth about the dangers they are all facing. When Sansa learns that her father has been arrested, she's scared, but much more fearful of what she does not know. Even after her father has been arrested and placed in the Black Cells, Sansa still doesn't quite see the twisted game Cersei is playing. Sansa still wishes to marry Joffrey even at this point. Confusion absorbs Sansa's thoughts even if she doesn't blatantly state this. Sansa has been coerced into conceding her father is guilty of treason in a letter to Robb. If not writing the letter herself, which there is some debate about that, her signature is definitely in that letter. There's a few lines from the first book that truly captivated me into empathizing with Sansa's position. When Sansa asks to see her father, Cersei responds with the following. "You disappoint me, Sansa," the queen said, with eyes gone hard as stones. "We've told you of your father's crimes. If you are truly as loyal as you say, why should you want to see him?" Sansa is being asked to choose her father or the fantasy she's always dreamed of. Sansa is stuck without the words to respond, other than to ask what is to come of her father. When Grandmaster Pycelle informs Sansa that it is for the king to decide, Sansa grows optimistic. You see, Sansa still believes that Joffrey is a good and fair Prince Charming that she has idolized since she was a little girl. Sansa has learned and has been taught that the world is this beautiful and forgiving place where everyone insists on doing the right thing. Just a couple paragraphs later in the same chapter, there is another point that I think really emphasizes a greater point. She pulled a chair close to the hearth, took down one of her favorite books, and lost herself in the stories of Florian and Jonquil, of Lady Shella and the Rainbow Knight, of valiant Prince Aemon and his doomed love for his brother's queen. It was not until later that night, as she was drifting off to sleep, that Sansa realized she had forgotten to ask about her sister. You see, Sansa is still living in a fantasy world. She escapes to her fantasies. She goes to her fantasy books, where you know that the stories and the history of Westeros may be fabricated, or at least embellished. The thing about this that is so terribly depressing is that her character doesn't understand the brutality of the world she lives in until it's too late. Of all the characters, you could argue Sansa experiences the greatest culture shock of them all when her father is beheaded. When she is kept in her room with Jane Poole, she often grows irritated by Jane's crying, even complaining about this to Cersei. Sansa isn't connecting with Jane's despair. In the book, Jane is a very important character, especially later in the story. But what contrasts her from Sansa is Jane is not in King's Landing fulfilling some fantasy about becoming queen someday. Fighting has broken out. Northmen have been murdered, and Jane knows nothing about her father's whereabouts, while Sansa thinks of Arya's whereabouts as a passing thought. Sansa is too caught up in making certain that her fantasy comes true, that thinking of anything else is simply irrelevant, regardless of how unfortunate the other things she does not think of will certainly turn out to be. When I discuss Sansa with other fans or hear other YouTubers discuss Sansa, typically it is a focus of eventually becoming another political manipulator such as Littlefinger in the later books. But what I think of when I think of Sansa, the thought I can't escape is the slow loss of her innocence in the first book. It is not until her father is killed in front of her does the fantasy finally feel warped. Up until Ned dies, the only thing warping her image of the happily ever after fairy tale is Arya being a brat, or her stubborn father wishing to send her home to Winterfell. She believes that if only Robb and her mother Catelyn would come to King's Landing and declare Joffrey king, swear to them their fealty, everything will be fine. Sansa is delusional until her world transforms so dramatically she must change her focus. And sadly for Sansa, she is simply a pawn with no true power or moves to make. Eventually, she does tell Joffrey that she just wants to be sent home, and her admiration for Joffrey has understandably left her very quickly. While Sansa weeps and begs at times, the illusion she had lived before has been replaced with a quiet shock and numbness. Grief is present, but the sensation of being dehumanized takes over Sansa as she falls into a dissociative state. The strangeness of losing a parent is compounded by the confusion one must feel as a hostage. Her prior identity is gone. The innocent girl aspiring to marry King Joffrey has been replaced with sorrow. Sansa's story is that of tragedy. The misfortunes of Sansa, unlike the other characters, are not readily baked into their backstories. This is similar to Arya, but Arya's natural tendency to defiance allows her to pursue a path much more fitting in a way, that has her able to not just pursue what she's always desired, but to thrive in certain ways. If Arya was in Sansa's position, Arya's defiance likely would find her killed, and vice versa. The way trauma greets Sansa and Arya are the beginnings of their transformation. The difference is that for Arya, the trauma only drives her childhood fantasies into a reality. Arya will become a killer. The trauma for Sansa obliterates her childhood fantasies. Her innocence has been weaponized against her and her family. And as your narrator, I find this incredibly tragic.